Hi, and welcome to my kitchen. My name is Diane Witten. I'm a food nutrition educator for Cornell Cooperative Extension of Saratoga County. I've been teaching home food preservation for over 15 years. I am a certified master food preserver. So I created this PowerPoint presentation, Canning Food at Home, Safety Guidelines and Methods. So whether you're new to canning or have some experience and just want to get more confident in your ability, or maybe you've done boiling water canning, but you haven't done pressure canning and you're thinking about that, this presentation will be a good one for you. What I'm hoping you'll learn are different types of canning methods, principles of safe canning, equipment and procedures, and some resources. So let's start with the resources. The number one resource that we recommend for home food preservation is the USDA National Center for Home Food Preservation. It's actually housed at the University of Georgia. That's why you see the website uga.edu, or the easier website to remember is simply homefoodpreservation.net. This is the home page to the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And the part I want to draw your attention to is this part here, how do I can. So if I clicked on that there, I would come to this page, how do I can. It has a lot of good general information, background information on canning, instructions on how to use boiling water canner and pressure canner. And then this down here are actually recipes. So if I clicked on canning fruits and fruit products, I would come to actual recipes on how to can fruits. Same thing with tomatoes and salsa, nuts products, vegetables, vegetable products, and canning poultry, meat, and seafoods. The other resource I want to draw your attention to is my web page at work, ccesaratoga.org. You look under nutrition food and then food preservation, you'll come to this page. And here I do have a link to the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And on the left-hand side, I have video links to a lot of different videos, some short, some long, on a lot of different topics, but I've just looked for some good, useful videos. And on the other side, I have a lot of fact sheets. There's lots of information out there, even from reputable sources, but I just pulled together some that I thought were particularly useful. So all different methods of food preservation are represented here, so you can look that up. So let's get into the presentation on the basics of home canning. Of course, first of all, you want to start with high quality food products. The recommendation is to preserve your food within 24 hours of harvest. If that's at all possible, that is definitely going to give you the best product, no matter which type of food preservation you're doing. And then prepare the food according to specific directions, following a USDA tested recipe. Use and follow directions from a reputable source, whether it is the USDA National Center for Home Food Preservation, which I told you has a lot of resources and recipes on it, or any other cooperative extension resource that you see online, which might have a .edu at the end of it. The University of Georgia, where the National Center for Home Food Preservation is housed, also has published So Easy to Preserve, which is a great book with all the background information plus recipes, and I kind of consider that my Bible. But anything that is in there is also on the website, homefoodpreservation.com or .net. And then the Ball Blue book, we know that they do test all the recipes, so we feel very confident recommending them. But beware of grandma's recipes, which you can find online. And we have found online some directions for canning, which really are unsafe, and or they won't produce the best quality product. So we really ask you to be careful about your resources, especially online. There are some important musts for canning, and one is to follow a canning recipe. Make sure it's a safe recipe, of course, from a good reputable source, and then follow it precisely. So if it says to cut your pumpkin into 1-inch cubes, then do that. Don't cut it into 2-inch cubes or 3-inch cubes, because that will affect the heat penetration and it will affect the safety of the product. If you are doing pressure canning and you have a dial gauge, you have to make sure that that's accurate, and I will talk more about that as we go on. and then make time or pressure adjustments depending on your altitude. Here is a chart that shows how much time to pressure can or can in a boiling water or steam canner. And I just want to point out the altitudes that are listed here. This is very important in terms of the temperature that water will boil out, or the pressure that you need to achieve the temperature that you want in a pressure canner. So when you're boiling water canning, if you're under 1,000 feet, you would can for 15 minutes, you would process for 15 minutes. If you're over 1,000 feet, up to 6,000 feet, you would process your product for 20 minutes. So when I say make adjustments according to altitude, that's what I mean. In pressure canning, the difference is if you're under 2,000 feet, you would pressure can at 11 pounds of pressure. If you're over 2,000, between 2,000 and 4,000 feet, you would pressure can at 12 pounds of pressure, and the pressure goes up as you go up in altitude. So how canning works? The way it works is food is placed in a canning or mason type jar, which is a good heavy glass. And then it's sealed with a 2-piece lid. The 2 pieces are the lid itself and the screw band. And the screw band is just used to keep the lid on during the canning process. And then food is heated to a temperature that destroys microorganisms, also inactivates enzymes that can cause changes in color, flavor, and texture, and it drives air out from the jar. And then as the jar cools, a vacuum seal is formed. The vacuum seal helps to hold the lid on the jar, so you don't need that ring anymore after you have your vacuum seal. It prevents recontamination of the food, and that's why canned foods will be safe indefinitely as long as the seal is good. We recommend that you use your home canned foods within a year, but if you find something that's been in your basement for 5 years, you can feel confident that it's going to be safe to eat as long as the seal is good. And then the vacuum seal also prevents air from drying out the food. There are 3 approved methods of canning foods at home. One is the boiling water canning method, which heats food to 212 degrees. And then the new one, which was just approved by the USDA in 2018, is atmospheric steam canning. And both of those can be used for canning acid foods. I'll go into each in more detail as we go on. The third method is pressure canning, which brings the temperature to at least 240 degrees. And this is used for low acid foods or a mixture of foods that are high acid and low acid foods. And the canning method that's recommended depends on the type of food. The foods are divided into 2 main categories for canning purposes: those that contain acid, called acid foods or acidic foods, and those that have very little or no acid, which we refer to as low acid foods. This chart shows the pH, which is a measure of basic acidity or alkalinity. And the pH number that's very important is 4.6, because if a food has a pH over 4.6, it would be considered a low acid food. So that would be your vegetables and meats. And those foods would have to be canned in a pressure canner. So the temperature gets above 240 degrees. Right in the borderline here is tomatoes. And this is why when you, if you have a good recipe for canning tomatoes, you'll see that it tells you to add lemon juice or citric acid to your tomatoes just to make sure that they are below 4.6 in acidity. So anything 4.6 or lower is considered a high acid food. And so that's all, fruits and acidified foods. Those can be canned in a boiling water canner. So again, acid foods, pH 4.6 or lower, and generally that includes all fruit. Some exceptions are tomatoes and figs, which are borderline. So your directions will tell you to add an acid to them. And then sauerkraut, which is a vegetable, but it is naturally acidified through the process of fermentation. And then foods which have large amounts of acid added, like pickles. So you're taking a cucumber, which is a low acid food, and you're putting a lot of vinegar in it, and you've acidified it. And that can be, all of these can be processed in a boiling water canner. Then we have low acid foods, which are a pH of 4.6 or higher. So that includes pretty much all vegetables, meats, poultry, seafood, soups, and mixtures of high acid and low acid foods. For instance, a spaghetti sauce, you've got your lower acid tomatoes, or your high acid tomatoes, and your low acid meats. So those would have to be canned in a pressure canner. And why do low acid foods have to be pressure canned to be safe? It's all because of this one bacteria, Clostridium botulinum. C. botulinum forms a protective heat-resistant spore. So it's different, it's unique to other bacteria which can't do that. So they're all killed at 212 degrees. But the C. botulism bacteria has this special ability to, when the heat rises, it creates this heat-resistant spore around it. And the spore requires a higher temperature to destroy it. And so that temperature would be 240 degrees, which is achieved during pressure canning. What can happen if low acid foods are not pressure canned? Well, the Clostridium botulinum can grow. It needs 4 conditions to grow. One is 40 to 140 degrees, which is basically shelf storage temperatures, right? We can foods so that we can store them at room temperature. So that's in the danger zone there. They also need a high moisture content, which is provided by the food in the jars, and they need a low acid environment. They will not grow if you have a high acid environment like fruits. So we don't have to worry about it in fruits and other high acid foods. And they also need an oxygen-free environment. And that's what we provide when we can. Like I said a few slides ago, the way canning works is that through heating the jars in the boiling water or the pressure canner, the air is drawn out of the jar and you get that vacuum seal. That creates an oxygen-free environment where the spores can germinate and form toxin-producing cells. The toxin is botulism, which you've probably heard of, and it is a very serious illness that can definitely cause death. There are now some antitoxins that can be given if you go to the hospital soon enough, but even with that, you could have ongoing medical issues. A food itself that might have the toxin in it shows no signs. So you can't look at it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it and tell that the toxin is there. And then if you eat that food, symptoms usually appear within 12 to 72 hours. It might be digestive upset, blurred vision, double vision, difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, and it can lead to death, as I said. And this is not something that's happened only in the past. This still happens today, that people get food poisoning from home canned foods that were canned in a boiling water canner. So in preventing botulism in home canned foods, a pressure canner must be used for low acid foods to achieve that temperature of at least 240 degrees. So use a recipe to know whether or not you have to do boiling water canner or pressure canning. It will tell you right there in the recipe how to process it. And the recipe will tell you how long to process it for. So follow the directions, explicitly follow those directions. And the directions, the time it tells you to process will differ depending on the size of the jar. And the time will differ depending on the consistency of the product you're making. All of the processing times have been determined in a laboratory. They have tested each recipe, and I believe it's 7 times. They actually make the recipe, they put it in the jar, and then they use this process of putting in the laboratory. They've got this thing called a thermocoupler, which is basically a thermometer that goes into the jar, and then it's attached with a wire to their equipment so that they can measure the temperature in the jar. And the temperature varies depending on whether you have solid food. The temperature would be around the center of the jar if you had solid foods, which heat by conduction, as opposed to the cold zone, which is towards the bottom of the jar, if you have liquid foods, which are heated by convection. So follow directions exactly. The following slow down heat penetration, adding extra sugar or fat. So don't add those if it's not called for in the recipe. Having food pieces larger than called for in the directions. I mentioned that earlier. If it says to cube your pumpkin to 1-inch cubes, then do 1-inch cubes. If you do 2-inch cubes, it's going to take longer for the heat to get to temperature in the coldest spot. And then thickeners also increase the amount of time it takes for the heat to penetrate. So don't add any thickeners. Now there are two methods of packing jars. One we call the raw pack method, and for this, it's used for foods that lose their shape when cooked. So you can place the raw food directly in the jar, and then boiling hot liquid is poured over the jar, over the food. Sometimes the liquid can be water, or it might be tomato juice or something else, depending on the recipe. And then you would just pack it in firmly, but don't really crush it into the jar. The other method is called the hot pack, which is the preferred method for most foods. And food is cooked before packing, which shrinks the food. And so because of that, fewer jars are needed. You also get less floating. And by floating, I mean, if you've got canned peaches or canned tomatoes, you might find them all the way at the top of the jar with liquid down at the bottom of the jar. And so if you cook it first, it drives a lot of the air out of the food, so you get less of that floating. And you'll get better color and flavor. It keeps better over the long term. It's easier to pack into the foods. The foods are less pliable. But if the directions say, if you only have directions for hot pack, then you must hot pack. Don't decide, oh, I'm just going to cold pack this. Because again, it has to do with how long it takes to heat up and reach the proper temperature to kill any bacteria. These two tables are for two different foods. This one is for cream style corn done in a dial gauge pressure canner. And this says to process for 85 minutes, pints for 85 minutes. This one is for snap and Italian beans, also in a dial gauge pressure canner. And this says the processing time is 20 minutes. So you can see the type of food that you're canning can make a big difference in terms of the amount of time it takes to process. And all of that has been determined in the laboratory setting. So we know that the recipes that you're getting from the USDA are safe. Headspace is something you have to consider when you're filling your jars. And that is the space between the top of the food and the top of the jar. And each recipe will tell you how much headspace to leave. So follow those directions. For jellied products, it's always 1/4 inch of headspace like you see here. For most other foods done in a boiling water canner, like fruits, tomatoes, pickles, it's usually a 1/2 inch headspace. When you're using a pressure canner and for low acid foods, the headspace is usually 1 to 1 1/4 inches. So we'll be looking for that in your recipes. If you leave too little headspace, the food may bubble out during processing, and that can interfere with the sealing. So after you're canning and things are cooled, you'll find that you don't have a seal and the lid comes right off. That you don't want. If you have too much headspace, let's say you didn't have quite enough to fill a jar and you decided to process it anyway, the food at the top is likely to discolor because there is some oxygen left in the jar, and that will discolor the food through oxidation. And the jars may not seal properly because not all the air has been forced from the jar in the process, so you won't get a vacuum seal. Okay, let's talk about the jars and lids. You want to wash your jars for doing canning, and before you put your food in it, and check to see if there's any nicks or scratches. And then you'll want to keep your jars hot until you add your hot food. Some people think they have to sterilize the jars for canning, and that is not the case. As almost all canned products, with the exception of jelly products, have a processing time of over 10 minutes, so you don't have to sterilize. If you are making a jellied product, jams or jellies, something like that, and the directions say to process it for only 5 minutes, then you would have to sterilize your jars first, which you can do right in your canner before you fill the jars. The other part of the two-piece lid, canning lids, are the lids themselves, which may or may not need to be preheated. The older lids, which are still on the market, require preheating. So read the instructions that come with the lids that you have. The newer lids are BPA free and they do not require preheating, which is nice because first of all, they're BPA free. And also that's one less step you have to do and one less pot of hot water you have to have in your kitchen. There are different types of boiling water canners. These are two typical ones. The one on the left is the enamel canner, which is probably the most ubiquitous one that you see around. I'm showing you the bottom of this canner though, because I want you to see the ridges on the bottom. The ridges on the bottom are great for using on a gas stove because you have more surface area. However, on a flat top or an electric stove, you don't have as much surface area touching the heating element itself, so it won't be as efficient. The one on the right is an aluminum boiling water canner. They also make them in stainless steel. This here is a stainless steel pot that I have at home, which I can use for a boiling water canner. This is a big stock pot, and I have a round cake rack that I can fit right into that pot. Every canner, whether it's a boiling water canner or a pressure canner, will come with a rack. You always have to have water or steam circling all around your jar, the top and the bottom. So if you don't have a canner at home and you want to practice doing some canning and you have a large stock pot that you can put a rack under, you can make your own canner. It just has to be deep enough to be able to cover the jars with 1 to 2 inches of water. So you've got your rack, you've got your jars, you've got 2 inches of water, and then enough room for the water to boil. If it's big enough for that, then you can use that as a boiling water canner. Your jars can be preheated in your canner, so while you're making your product, you can have your clean jars in the canner already heating up. So to use a boiling water canner, you want to have about 6 inches of simmering or hot water in your canner. If you're doing hot pack, which is what's recommended for most foods, your water should be just about a simmer. And if you're doing raw pack, your water can be hot, but not too hot. The reason for that is because we don't want to shock the jars. If you're putting cold raw food in a jar into your real hot canner, it might shock the jars and break them. And if you have nice hot food and you're putting it in a hot jar, you can put it in the simmering water and then you'll be able to bring it up to the boiling water temperature quicker if you have that simmering already. So you can place your filled jars right on the rack in the canner, and the water, check to make sure the water is covering over the jars by at least 1 inch or 2. You want 2 inches if you have a long processing time. 1 inch, if your processing time is 10 or 15 minutes, 1 inch is fine. But if you have a longer processing time, you want to have 2 inches in there so that the water doesn't boil out by the time your processing time is over. Once your canner has gotten to a full rolling boil, then you can begin the processing time. So if it says to process for 15 minutes, you would wait till the water in your canner got to a full rolling boil before you started timing. And don't forget to adjust the time for altitude if you're over 1,000 feet. After your processing time is complete, you can turn off the stove and then remove the lid, being careful to tip the lid away from your face so you don't get a steam burn, and then wait 5 minutes before taking the jars out. During that 5 minutes, the water will calm down, the food in the jar will calm down, and there's less likely chance that it might, you might get a bad seal. So leave them in there for 5 minutes, let things cool down. And as you're removing the jars, don't tip them. Same thing goes for when you're putting the jars in. Especially when you're taking the jars out though, you might be tempted to tip the jar because there'll be some water on the top of the jar. And if you tip it, some of the food that's in the jar might get between the rim of the jar and the lid. At this point, when you're taking it out of the water, you don't have your vacuum seal yet. So food could come in between the lid and the rim of the jar. So be careful to take your jars out, keeping them straight up and down. And then place your jars on a towel or a cooling rack away from drafts. You definitely don't want to put it on any cold surface, like if you have a granite or quartz countertop, which is very cold, your jars could break. And then leave them, put them someplace where they're going to be out of your way, where you can leave them undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. After that time, you can take the rings off and check the seal, check to make sure that the lids are on. You can just try to pull the lid off gently, and if it doesn't come off, then you have a good seal. And then you'll wipe off the jars, clean it from any debris that might have gotten on there during the processing time, and store in a cool, dark place like in your pantry. Okay, steam canning. I'm excited about steam canning. I've started using this a lot. This has kind of become my preferred method over boiling water canning. Because in boiling water canning, you put the jars in the boiling water and there's more chance that the jars are going to tip over. But I have never had that problem with steam canning. And this was researched recently so that people could can using less water. And what the research has found, which was done at the University of Wisconsin, they found that the timetables for processing in a boiling water canner were effective effective for steam canning. So it's nice that we have a new method of canning. We don't have new timetables for how long to can things. We can just use the timetables that have been already established for boiling water canning if you're doing steam canning. One of the downfalls of the steam canner is that you cannot use it if your processing time is 45 minutes or greater. The reason for that is because over that period of time, the water can evaporate out of your steam canner. So, and there's not a lot of things that are processed for that amount of time, but there are some things that are processed for that time. If you're doing pickles and jams and jellies, those don't have that high of processing time. So if that's primarily what you're doing, you'd be fine. So to use a steam canner, you want to take that lid off and then put water in right up to the level of the rack, and preheat the water to it's about steaming while you're preparing your product. And then after filling your jars, you're going to place your jars on the rack in the canner and then put the canner cover on it. And then this arrow is pointing to a little vent hole. So look to see where that vent is, and that vent is important, and we're going to have to vent the steam out of there for about 10 minutes. But you just be careful that you don't have that pointing like right towards you. You might want to turn it till it's in the back so that all that steam isn't coming right out at you. And as I said, the canning processing time for, let's say this is choice salsa, the can in a boiling water canner, well, it's the same processing time for a steam canner, 15 minutes if you're below 1,000 feet, 20 minutes if you're between 1,000 and 6,000 feet. So it's important to know your altitude when you're canning. At the end of the processing time, you'll turn off the stove And then wait 5 minutes before removing the lid. This is different from boiling water canner. As soon as we turn off the stove, we took the lid off. But with the steam canner, if you take the lid off right away, it cools down a little too fast, and that can affect your sealing. And then to finish the process, the same thing with the boiling water canner. Remove your jars and place them an inch apart on a cooling rack or towel and leave them undisturbed for up to 24 hours. Check your seals, remove the rings, and wipe off jars before storing in a cool, dark place. Okay, let's talk about pressure canners. There are two basic types of pressure canners. The one on the left is the dial gauge canner. The one on the right is called a weighted gauge canner. The weighted gauge canner, there's a lot of different manufacturers of these canners. The weight itself, which on this canner, the weight is right here. The weight itself varies in terms of how it looks, but they all function the same. The dial gauge canner has what looks like a weight on it, and it is a weight actually, but it's just considered a counterweight. The weight on the weighted gauge canner is actually a three-piece weight, or on some brands, it gives you 3 options for how much pressure you're going to put in the can. So depending on your altitude, you might need to pressure can at 11 pounds of pressure or 12 or 13 pounds of pressure. And so you can adjust that with either the dial gauge or changing the amount of weights that you put on your weighted gauge. Today's new canners have a lot of safety features built in. They always have like some kind of plug like this that would just blow off before the canner exploded. I think people are afraid of pressure canning because they've heard horror stories of canners exploding. And they also, a lot of the newer ones have locks built in so that you cannot open the canner while it's still pressurized. Let's talk about pressure cookers, because pressure cookers have become very popular, and some people are asking us if they can actually can in a pressure cooker. The biggest difference between a pressure cooker and a pressure canner is usually the size. So the USDA recommends that if you're using a canner that holds at least 4 quart-sized jars standing upright in the canner with the lid on, then it's big enough to use as a pressure canner. Otherwise, it's strictly a cooker and it should not be used for pressure cooking. The research that was done by the USDA on pressure processing was conducted in canners that are about the size of a 16-quart or larger pressure canner. And the size makes a big difference. The size is going to impact how quickly it heats up and how quickly it cools down. And a significant amount of the lethality, a significant amount of the time and temperature that the food is held at, in terms of how it will kill the bacteria that's in there, is achieved during the heat up and the cool down time. So if you have a small pressure cooker and you're doing some canning, it won't be held at a high enough temperature for a long enough period of time. So that's why you should not pressure can in a small pressure cooker unless it will hold at least 4 jars, 4 quart-sized jars. One other thing to keep in mind with pressure canning is testing of your dial gauge. Your dial gauge has to be accurate. And because this is just a little mechanical device, it is possible for it to be inaccurate. So what the USDA recommends is having your pressure dial gauge tested every year before you start canning to make sure it's accurate. Now, Cooperative Extension does do pressure canning depending on the county. At Cornell Cooperative Extension in Saratoga County, I do have an apparatus that I send my dial gauge in to be tested every year to make sure it's accurate, and then I will compare yours with mine to make sure your dial gauge is accurate. You would have to contact the Cooperative Extension in your county, and there are Cooperative Extension offices in many counties if not most counties in the United States. So you can check that. If your dial gauge is off by more than 2 pounds, we would tell you to get a new gauge. Otherwise, you can just make some adjustments. But this is one of the, I think, one of the disadvantages to having a dial gauge canner versus a weighted gauge canner. The weight will always be accurate. You don't have to worry about testing it. Again, adjusting for altitude is different depending on whether you have a dial gauge or a weighted gauge canner. I have two different, these are the same foods, okay? These are snap and Italian beans. These are both the same foods, but your recipe will designate how much pressure your food needs depending on whether you have a dial gauge or a weighted gauge canner. So if you live under 2,000 feet, it's going to be 11 pounds of pressure. If you live at over 2,000 feet, between 2,000 and 4,000 feet, let's say, you're going to need 12 pounds of pressure. So when you have a dial gauge, you can go up by 1 pound of pressure. And that's one of the advantages to having a dial gauge canner. If you live over 2,000 feet, it will tell you to increase the pressure, or no, I'm sorry, if you live above 1,000 feet, your directions for a weighted gauge canner will tell you to increase the pressure from 10 pounds of pressure to 15 pounds of pressure, which you really only need 12 pounds of pressure, but because you have a weighted gauge canner, you can't go up by 1 pound increments. You can only go up by 5 pound increments. So that would just mean you're going to be slightly over processing your food if you live above 1,000 feet and you have a weighted gauge canner. So that's something also to keep in mind when you're deciding whether or not to buy a dial gauge or a weighted gauge canner. So let's look at how we use a pressure canner. First of all, you only need 2 to 3 inches of simmering or hot water in your canner. The jars do not get submerged in water like they do for a boiling water canner. And then if you're doing the hot pack method, you would put it in your canner when the water is simmering. If you're doing the raw pack method, the water just needs to be hot when you put your canner in there. You place your jars on the rack in the canner and then put the lid on the canner without the weight or the petcock open. So in a dial gauge canner, that would be the counterweight that I was talking about. In some of the older canners, they have what they call a petcock, which is just a little thing that you flip up that will allow the steam to come out. And when you flip it down, it doesn't allow the steam to come out and starts to build the pressure. But when you're first starting, you want the pressure, the steam to be able to come out. This is a picture of a weighted gauge canner. And so if you have, and this is another weighted gauge canner here. So for these, you would just leave the weight off initially. And then you're going to exhaust it for 10 minutes, which means after you get a good steady stream of steam escaping from the hole there, you would allow it just to steam for 10 minutes. And this is an extremely important part, and you should not skimp on the amount of time that you do this for or skip it altogether. During this time, what is happening is the air is being exhausted from the canner so that the canner becomes a complete steam environment. And so that you're cooking you're heating your jars in a complete steam environment. So after 10 minutes, you're going to close the vent or petcock. And then once you get to the proper temperature, then you start counting your time. So your processing time is 20 minutes. You would start processing after you've reached the appropriate pressure. Now, how you know you've got the appropriate pressure for a dial gauge canner, you can read the gauge to see if it's at the right pressure. For the weighted gauge canners, the different manufacturers will give you different instructions on how to know when your canner is at the right pressure. And don't forget to adjust for altitude. After your processing time, you can turn the heat off at the end of processing, and then just let the pressure drop to 0 naturally. And this can take a significant amount of time, depending on how big your canner is, how much food you have in your canner, how thick the walls of your canner are. but normally it's at least 40 minutes, or it could be significantly longer than that too. And as I said before, the heating up time and the cooling down time in pressure canners is counted towards the heat penetration. So you do not want to try to quick cool your canner. So do not force cool your canner. Let it just cool down naturally. After the pressure drops to 0 degrees of pressure, if you have a dial gauge, you can see it right on the dial that it's at zero pressure. You can remove your weight or open the petcock. With a weighted gauge canner, you're just going to wait at least 30 or 40 minutes, and then you can touch or nudge your pressure, your weighted pressure gauge. And when you touch it, if steam comes out, then there's too much steam in there. It's not down to 0% pressure yet. And then after you do get to 0% pressure, wait another 10 minutes before you open the canner. And again, be careful of the steam. When you open that canner, even though it's 0% or 0 pounds of pressure, you'll see that the food in there is really boiling. It's still very hot, so be careful. And then you'll remove the jars to a towel or cooling rack and let them rest for 12 to 24 hours, and then check the seals and clean the jars before putting them away. For storing home canned foods, after you're done, you're gonna store them without the ring bands. The ring bands are there just to hold the lid in place during processing and while it's cooling. While it's cooling, that creates the vacuum seal, and the vacuum seal will hold the lid on. You don't need the ring band on there. So take the ring band off and clean it thoroughly and dry it thoroughly and store it in a plastic bag, and you'll be able to reuse the ring bands for years. The lids itself cannot be reused. They're all one use only. There are some brands that do have reusable lids. So if you're interested in that, you can research that. The USDA has not done research on those lids, but they say, you know, if you use proper procedures and if your lid does stay on, you have a continuous seal, that you know, they could be used for home canning. But it's right now the USDA just recommends the 2-piece lid that we see here. Okay, so thank you for attending my presentation. I hope that you learned a lot here. If you want to contact me, my name is Diane Witten. I'm at dwitten@cornell.edu. And again, please feel free to check our website for more videos. I have some videos, and I have videos from other sources. Some are just 1-2 minute videos. Some are 5-20 minutes long. And that would be ccesaratoga.org. Thank you very much.